Good morning, afternoon, or evening, folks, and welcome to Cast of All Trades, the show where we talk about developing skills, exploring ideas, and following curiosity. I'm your host, Orion Siebert, and in this episode, I have the pleasure of talking to Dustin Miller, the Poly Innovator, host of the Polymath Polycast podcast, and a fellow Renaissance man. In this episode, we talk about creating knowledge management systems for generalists and how to keep them simple yet effective, Dustin's polymathic spectrum, why Legos is a key behind Dustin's success, and much more. I loved doing this interview with Dustin. He's a great guy. It was so fun to connect with him, chatting with him before and after the interview. We just connect on so many levels. It's great. He's a fellow creator in this jack of all trades, polymathic space, whatever you want to call it. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to go check out his stuff, because trust me, it's great. You'll love it. And for even more generalist content, make sure to subscribe here so you don't miss out on further episodes I have coming up. I've got some exciting ones down the pipeline. I believe that about covers it. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Dustin Miller, the Poly Innovator. Dustin, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me on, Ryan.
Yeah. So, for those who don't know or who haven't listened to your episode where I came onto your show, who are you and what is it that you do?
I am Dustin Poly Innovator. I am a prolific content creator. I make videos, podcasts, and blog posts. I'm actually I'm reaching up to 600 blog posts on my website now, which is really awesome. I've been doing the Polymath Polycast, which I had you on for about 7 years now. 3 years into it, I started doing interviews. I've done between my two shows around 150 interviews at this point, which after 4 years, maybe I should have done more, but I've been cranking them out like crazy. Just even before this call, I was trying to edit. I've been trying to do a ton of different content and add in this kind of world of polymathy and try to see if I can highlight people's lives like that.
Well, awesome. Congrats on almost hitting 600 blog posts. That's amazing. Like, about how long and how much time have you put into that in particular?
I think that for the most part, I believe I started around 2012 with blogging, and I started on a previous endeavor before my personal brand, Poly Innovator. But ironically, the topics were pretty much the same. So when I got back to doing it in 2017, I took a few years off as a teenager. And when I got back to it, it was really interesting. I took the old blog post, revamped them in my new skills and styles, and then combined it all into my main website. And so from on 2017 onward, maybe 2016 even a little bit, I was doing more and more blog posts. And over the last few years, I've been really working on consistency. I have around 4 newsletters, which kind of contribute to that blog post ecosystem. But I also just make random posts too. I have what I call the Fireside Codex, which is like a public journal entry. And so if you ever wanted to know more about my life, or if I'm trying to distill my feelings into words, this is the way I express myself. I figured if Da Vinci ever published his notes, it would have helped a lot of people. I'm not saying I'm Da Vinci, but if I can work towards that goal, I like to be public a little bit if I can.
One step at a time.
Yes.
We'll get there. 4 newsletters, a blog, number of podcasts. How do you manage all of that?
Knowledge management. So my main personal brand niche, I guess you could say, or meta niche, if you will, is knowledge management for polymaths. And so organizing your multidisciplinary life, it's probably very helpful for a lot of jacks of all trades out there as well, or Jills of all trade, if you want to be like genderified about it. Some people say Jamie of all trades, so it's kind of gender neutral, which is funny.
Never heard
I
of
like
that one.
kind of. Yeah, I kind of like because it makes it a little bit easier. But Jote is a little bit easier in general too. And regardless of where you're at on your polymathic journey, being able to organize all the different facets of your interests, I think, is very important.
Mm-hmm. So I wasn't going to talk about this till later, but we've already touched on it, so may as well dive into it.
Sure.
Tell me a bit more about knowledge management and what really got you into it.
So really the start was because of my content. So I was messing with like Monday.com, Asana, and eventually Notion too. I actually tried out every project and task management tool on the market that I could find. I even made a huge list about it that got really popular on Medium, and then I moved it onto my main website too. And I was literally just trying any tool I could find. ClickUp ended up working kind of all right, but I needed something with more layers of extraction. So I could start having like, okay, here's the content layers, but then here's my projects, just that kind of thing. And so I realized the Notion was pretty Lego-like. You could kind of build up a system that you wanted. I went into Notion full force, and it was really interesting. I was able to create a holistic system that eventually became my modular degree, which is self-education, my content ecosystem, which is kind of like the output, my content and production, and then the holistic system above that, the PIOS, which is what I call the Poly Innovations operating system, which is my knowledge management philosophy that I created or methodology. And so that kind of passion started really because of Notion. Eventually, I tried out other tools because Notion became a little bit more limited and the performance started really faltering quite often. And so I use Obsidian now, which is a great note taking tool. But that's how it started. It was mainly because of the content production.
So, out there question, really,
Yeah.
really out there. Have you ever heard or have you ever seen the productivity midwit meme?
Is that like what it's called? I don't think so.
So, I have a picture of it in my notes. I'm gonna show you here, and I'm going to describe it for everyone else. So, it describes it's a big bell curve, and basically on the left, the low IQ guy says, "I just use Apple Notes." The
Mhm.
guy in the middle says, readwise into Google Drive with an Obsidian network, linking
Mhm.
Evernote and Notion to Anki and Quizlet to review all my notes with PDF backups in OneNote, where it's this big, massive tree of like systems all connecting into each other. It seems super complex. And then the Jedi on the right says, "I just use Apple Notes."
Yeah.
The question I want to ask, since you've you've dug into a lot of these different programs, you have your list of these are all the knowledge management tools there are. The question I really want to ask is, how do you stop yourself from making knowledge management way too complicated?
Yeah, that's why I left Notion because Notion was me in the middle of that bell curve. I was making my system too out of proportion, and the thing is, because it was so Lego-like, I kept wanting to deconstruct it and rebuild it. I always did that growing up with my Legos. I wanted to build the best spaceship I could, and so I constantly kept reiterating it. And I found myself coming back to Obsidian. So this is the third time I went to Obsidian. Let me give you a holistic journey a little bit there because I started out with those project management tools and then Notion. I was in Notion for like 5 or 6 years. Eventually, I got tired of having everything on the cloud because it kept breaking down on me when AWS went down. With my internet was out, I couldn't access it. It was very frustrating. So I wanted a local tool. I went into Obsidian. Actually, I went to Obsidian a year before I left Notion and hated it. I went back to Obsidian when I was really upset with Notion and I loved it. I fell in love with it the second time. And then I found myself having some issues with project management plugins, not being able to plan out my content very well because I used a very advanced database in Notion. And so I left Obsidian for Capacities, which is a very great, but again, online project management tool, knowledge management kind of in a way. But again, since it was online, I found myself not being able to use it. I moved to, let's see, what was it? I think Acrium at that point, which is a local tool, but it kept breaking down on me. So I went back to Obsidian, and it felt like you're saying there on the end of the bell curve, the Jedi kind of aspect. Yes, my system's still a bit complex, but it's a very simple complex system, if that makes sense. It's very oxymoron because it's 6 layers. You have the yearly, quarterly, monthly, weekly, daily, and then the archive. And because of that, every layer kind of just has its own place. It's very simple when it comes to like if I want to know what I need to do, I know exactly where to look. And so I keep track of all my projects, phases, and tasks. I keep track of all my notes. I keep track of all the people I contact and stuff like that. Like I'm gonna have our interview in there safely set it aside. Like, here's the shows I went on. Here's the show I have with you on it too. And so it's one of those things where I kind of came back to the first full circle, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So, as someone who is somewhat terrified of switching my all of my notes over, or trying to find some other tool to try out for a bit,
Right.
since I'm an avid Google Drive user. I have a massive Google Drive tree that is chaos to anyone who doesn't know how it works, but there's folders nested in folders, nested in folders, sometimes going
Mhm.
4 or 5 layers deep, which is not not UI friendly or not UX friendly. I should know that quite well. But what should someone who is looking at maybe trying out some new knowledge
Mhm.
management tools, what should they maybe be looking at, or how should they maybe try to approach either switching tools or trying out a new tool for the first time?
Good question. If I may be so bold, I would say you're probably getting close to the climax of the bell curve. In your head, you might be on the descending half. In my head, I think you're on the ascending half. You're reaching a point of complexity that's going to make you want to switch. At some point, it's going to get really annoying to you with the information architecture, and you're going to be frustrated, and you're going to be like, okay, now I need to switch.
Since
And
I don't know,
so,
the thing is though, it works well for me, and I
Yeah.
think in my mind it's simple because it's all Google. Everything is Google Drive. Do I
Yeah.
hate Google on a personal level? Yes, I do.
Sure.
But does it work well? Yeah, sadly, yes.
Here, I mean, I used to use Google Sheets and Google Docs when I first started out, and so that was before the whole project management system things too. And what I found that I hated doing is that every Google Sheet, for example, had to have a link to a separate Google Doc. And when I went into Notion, every line of a database was its own document. And a lot of other tools now were like that too. Even in Obsidian, it's kind of like that. And so by having that single layer taken away, not having to have a separate tool. Even though it's in the same ecosystem, you still have to go to a whole separate Google tool for you to go into that document. Those are seconds of loading and waiting that actually add up quite a bit. And it also leads you to having to copy the link, put it into the Google Sheet, that kind of thing. If going back to your question, I think a bit too, when it comes to switching tools, I find that most of these tools have really crappy import and export functions. And so every time I switched, I had to manually move thousands of files over. So when I moved from Notion to Obsidian, I only moved about half of it because I had so much in Notion over the years. I had moved from Evernote, Google Docs, and personal notes on the computer all into Notion. So it was a lot in there. But since I didn't have a database in Obsidian, I could only move half of it. Then when I went to capacities, I moved about half of my Obsidian stuff, another third or fourth out of my Notion into capacities because they had finally had databases again. And so then I was split between three different tools. And finally, I was able to move most of things out of Notion, everything out of Obsidian, everything out of capacities into Acrium. And then it was pretty easy to move to Obsidian after that because it was all marked down local on the computer. But still, it was a lot. I wasted basically a whole month of time last year moving between all these different tools. Some people might say it was shiny object syndrome. For me, I think it really was just trying to find the right tool. Like sure, there were certain features I wanted, like, oh, that's pretty. Oh, I want that. It was actually out of necessity. And so I'm glad I did it, but I did end up wasting a whole month of movement of just time for just moving. I think that people need to realize there's no easy way to do it. If you're going to move tools, make sure you do the research and do it. I do very much believe that most people should probably using Obsidian if you're in this kind of world. I think that is the most versatile tool when you're multifaceted.
Interesting. I never really thought about the import export function of a lot of these tools, but thinking about it now, it actually makes a lot of sense to me why most wouldn't have an export function, but I wish they at least had an
Yeah,
import function because you don't want people leaving your tool. If you people
yeah.
are, it's sort of like the Apple ecosystem where people say it's a garden, but it's a walled garden. It's very beautiful on
Mhm.
the inside. If you're in Apple's walled garden, you don't want to leave, and if you do want to leave, those are some very high walls you have to climb. It's very difficult.
I actually recently had an issue with Apple where like I want to be able to manage my podcast on Apple Podcasts and I
Oh
don't have
God,
any
that
Apple
sucks.
products.
Oh, I hated doing
Yeah,
that.
it was horrible.
hmm Don't get me wrong. Apple support staff, they were great. They helped out so much for me when I was trying to get on Apple Podcasts. But the fact that I had to go to Apple support just to do that, God, that was irritating.
I had the opposite experience because basically not only could I not find the Apple phone number because I didn't have an activated Apple account, they blocked me from seeing it. I had to find it a third party way. When I was on the call with them, it was almost 2 hours, and I got switched between six different people. And the final person was a tech person. The tech person literally ended up just saying at the end, "I guess you just have to go get an iOS device because like I can't do it on this way." I could not, even though I
Wow.
used iTunes and Apple Music to sign in and try to activate my account. And the way to activate is just adding a debit card. That's all it was. I added it twice through Apple.com, so it was on the account. It just wasn't activated. And literally, it wasn't until I was able to steal someone's iPad and like log in real quick, sign in, then like log back out, was I actually able to do it.
Wow, that's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
So, slightly derailed there, but I'm happy to have another fellow Apple hater on the show maybe. I don't know if hate is the proper term, but
No, I loathe them.
uh wonderful. Well, definitely derailed that conversation a bit, but I want to bring this back to a bit more close to home here of jack of all trades, polymathy, renaissance
Mhm.
persons, whatever. You consider this like these groups, the generalists, the jotes, the renaissance man, the polymath, to all be different. Can you explain your thought process and like your thoughts of what are the differences between these people? Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, when you start looking at the definitions, and there's a lot more people talking about polymathy now, like Dr. Angela Cotalesa, Michael Araki, they are literally trying to quantify what makes a polymath and how do you level it up kind of thing. When I started looking at all these definitions, I actually went above and beyond and tried to look at every single piece of media about these terms. So I went on a deep dive for generalist, jack of all trades, Renaissance person, universalist, polymath, multi-potentialite, multidisciplinary. I looked at all those keywords and tried to find every single piece of content online for it. And I even made a whole series about it because the idea of these different terms are identifying markers. Like I identify with this. When we had you on my show, we talked about this a little bit. It's like, while your opinion of jack of all trades is not wrong by any means, it's one of those things where to me, I see jack of all trades towards the beginning of a spectrum. I created a spectrum of these terms to try to help people level up to their multifaceted experience because it really comes down to the level of expertise and how many expertise. And that's how I define them on this polymathic multidisciplinary scale. And for people who are listening in, I even did kind of a little hand gesture of a bar
Mhm.
chart. Like, here's a scale.
It's a very, very beautiful hand gesture. I will say that.
Thank you.
Yes. So, what does the scale kind of look like? You said that it's based
Yeah.
on the number of skills and the depth of those skills.
Yeah.
So, can you go a bit more in depth into that of what might this
Yeah.
sort of be like?
So I need to preface this by saying that this is, when it comes to the number of skills and how I define each term based on those number of skills, that is my opinion. I think that there is probably some room for improvement on it. I'm still developing this scale, so I want to kind of just preface that.
Of
But I
course.
think it's still pretty like respectable. I try to make sure each term is like, I like each term. I don't dislike, just because I like polymath, I don't dislike multipotentialite or jack of all trades. I'm just trying to help people understand who they are,
Oh,
basically,
those
and
gosh
where.
dang Renaissance men! How dare they?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and it's like I want people to realize that they have more potential and they can always improve. Maybe it's the personal trainer in me, but like you can always have some room to improve. So okay, it starts off with the multi-potentialite because the potential to do multiple different things is not the same as doing those different things. And I think a lot of people in the polymathic space agree with me on that. There is kind of this almost dichotomy between multi-potentialite and polymath because it's like the expert versus the person who has the potential to become an expert. But I see it as someone said on my show, pluripotent. Like a stem cell is pluripotent; it can adapt to any part of the body and become a cell of that point. So pluripotent is the perfect word for multipotential. Like you have the potential, and you could basically be anything you want to be, essentially. And I love that.
Interesting. It's like
Yeah,
the little kid at the beginning of school when the teacher says, "You can go and do anything you want."
yeah, and I know plenty of adults who like that word, especially the neurodivergent community. I think really like the potential to do many different things, and there is a kind of a, I think, correlation between a lot of neurodivergence and polymathy and becoming and being polymathic, I guess you could say. And the next step up is a jack of all trades, and I think that the reason why it's there is because while there are people who are jack of all trades who are experts too, I definitely know that that kind of skill can be a little bit wider than most people might realize. I think that generally the jotes are about 10 to 15 different areas of skills. And generally those areas are between novice and maybe adept. Not too deep, but like not just basic level either.
It's like
And
30 to 50% competency.
maybe even 45%.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, because it's really kind of, maybe actually, it's more like 25 to 40 or
Okay.
45% because it's kind of lower competency. Because generally, the thing is, like, you're trying to put your hands in all the different cookie jars. You may only eat one cookie, maybe two cookies, three cookies. You're starting to dig in a little bit deeper, but you're not really choosing a particular favorite just yet. Whereas the generalist, the next step up, is getting to the point where, like, okay, now you found five different cookies that you like, maybe just three, but generally like five, at max like six. And you're really enjoying these different cookies, and you're starting to learn how to make those cookies yourself and replace the cookies in the jar. Like
So we
I'm
would
just trying,
say
I'm going really,
instead of 15 to 20 at 20 to like 30%, now we're going to 5 to 6 skills at like maybe
40
30
to
to
50, 40 to 60, even something like
okay,
that.
yeah.
Maybe 30. Like I think maybe you're kind of being a little bit more hesitant about it. And I think I need to be too. Maybe I'm giving too much credit. But
It's your
again,
scale, you decide.
yeah,
Just
no,
trying to put
I
some numbers
again,
on
it's
this.
exactly. And because I never really thought too deep about the percentage. I was always thinking like novice or adept or journeyman or experts or master. I was
Mhm.
kind of using that more archaic scale. But the percentages I think will be really helpful. Maybe I need to put that on the chart. Thank you for bringing it up. So I
Score.
didn't think about the percentage. Yeah. And then like you also have situations where you might be a T-shaped person. So it's kind of a branched path. And a T-shaped person is like a jack of all trades where they have a huge width, maybe like 10 or 12, not quite 15, but like 10 or 12. But then they have like one area of expertise that's like journeyman level. They're not an expert per se. They might be, but they're usually not. And then they have like one area where they're really good at. And so after that, you have like the expert generalist. So again, it comes down to having one really big expert. So you are an expert in that one field, but instead of having 15 novice adept areas, you might have 10 adept or not journeyman, but the next level up, essentially like 40-50% level.
All right.
And so that's kind of like later on in life, I feel like. And then you have polymath, someone with 3 or more areas of expertise, and all the different terms have a curiosity, but especially the polymath is insatiably curious. And you have 3 or more areas of deep level expertise.
Interesting. Okay. No, while I may personally not agree with your scale, I think it's a great reference and a great tool that
Mm-hmm.
people can use to say, where do I, like, both, where am I on this right now? And two, where do I want to be on this
Mm-hmm.
scale? Because I feel like if people don't have something to shoot for, like, it's a quote from Alice in Wonderland where Alice asks, which road should I take? And the Cheshire Cat says, where do you want to go? Well, nowhere in
Mm-hmm.
particular, then any road will take you there, so long as you have a destination in mind, even if it's a semi arbitrary, I don't want to be the jack of all trades, I want to be the T shaped person, then
Mm-hmm.
you at least have a direction to go in.
Yeah.
That's some of the value that a scale like that will actually provide.
I'm curious why you don't agree about the whole jack of all trades versus polymath, too. That's kind of an interesting dynamic.
And I've just never really thought all too deeply into it. Like there are certainly
Okay.
aspects of that I can agree with. I definitely agree that there is some sort of scale, but I think it's a more, these are all synonyms for each other, and that it's like an individual, what percentage are you at to, like, interesting way to phrase it, of what percentage are you at to jack of all trades mastery or polymath mastery, if that makes any
Mm.
sense. But I don't know, I haven't thought too deeply into it. This is mostly off the cuff.
Exactly. And on top of that, too, I used to call it the polymath spectrum, but I didn't want to alienate Jotes or multipotentialites or generalists because there's some people who really adapt to those terms. They anchor to those terms, like you anchor to jack of all trades. And while I might have anchored to polymath, I really care more about being multidisciplinary. I care about being polymathic. And so, like, even myself, people call me a polymath when I go on people's shows. I rather call myself a proto polymath, someone who's more of a generalist, becoming a polymath. And my journey of polymathy is what I'm sharing with the world. And so that's why I changed it to the multidisciplinary spectrum because I think that's more applicable to most people. And so I care more about like what do you anchor with, and then how can we level you up, regardless of the term you're using. But like, just I care about leveling up.
Mm-hmm. That gamer lifestyle, endless
Yeah,
XP. Let me farm
skill
all that
trees.
XP.
Yeah,
Indeed. Please tell me you were an RPG junkie. Oh yeah. He's nodding his head. So,
yeah. I was about to say. Sorry, I'm nodding.
yep. Uh, yeah. So with this whole jack of all trades, polymathy, whatever you want to call it, take me
Mhm.
back to the beginning. Where did you start your polymath journey? Why choose this lifestyle? Because I feel like it is a choice.
I Okay, I don't like disagree, but I also don't agree that it's a choice. There
All
are
right.
some people who are naturally polymathic, like Da Vinci, obviously example. I think myself, I was always like that. From a young age, I wanted to be a businessman. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. Like I was 8 or 9 when I asked my family for office supplies for my birthday so I could be a businessman. And the reason why I think is because they generally entrepreneurs wear many hats. And I kind of knew that from a young age. I may have not understood it, but in retrospect, I knew that they wore many hats, and I wanted to do that. I wanted to use many different skills to accomplish that. And then in middle school, I did a really in-depth research paper, like presentation, not paper, but presentation on Leonardo da Vinci, and he quickly became my hero. I have like 5 books over here about him. I pointed to my bookshelf, and it's interesting to think about how Da Vinci had 15 areas of expertise. So there is another step up from polymath, and I call it the universalist polymath. And Da Vinci is like a prime example of that. So someone with maybe 6 or 10 or more areas of expertise, and he literally had multiple areas of deep knowledge in those areas. So it wasn't just like, oh, he was surface level. He was an expert in physics. He was an expert in laser physics and ocular science, and it was insane how much he knew. Painting, sculpting, engineering,
Biology.
and Exactly, biology, anatomy. He was one of the like founders of anatomy. It's crazy. And so the idea of a universalist polymath is something that I want to achieve in my life. And I kind of knew that as a teenager too. I wanted to become the modern Da Vinci. And it's not an ego thing. It's just like I just want to be able to do that. There's a lot of things I want to do in my life. So that's where a lot of that came from. It's always been inside of me. And that's why I think that like there are some people who are naturally polymathic and they are born this way. And there's some people who become it. So either because they're neurodivergent or because they had 4 different careers and they're 80 years old and they became a polymath because they switched every 10 years to do something else. And so like I think that sometimes it just happens to people and they don't realize it. Hence why I wanted to have people on my show and help them identify it if they don't know. Some people do know, like you, I think obviously did know. So it's great to have you on and to have that conversation. But I saw some people on my show where like the light hits their eyes and like they realize that they are multifaceted, they are generalists. It's awesome.
Hmm. For the average person who like maybe isn't aware of this life path, or like,
Mm-hmm.
maybe they just aren't naturally polymathic. For the average person, whatever that means, do you think it's smart for them to try to pursue this more generalist path, or would it maybe be better for a lot of them to take the more traditional, go become an expert in one thing, live out that life
Yeah.
path?
I don't think that defining that the specialism path is traditional is the right play because it's only been traditional for the past 100 years, all
I would
throughout
agree
our
with you there.
society.
I only call it
Yeah, I know.
traditional for the sake of modern,
Yeah,
quote unquote, modern traditionalism. If that makes
yeah.
absolutely no sense, but yeah.
I get what you're saying at least. And I think we're on the same page. I just wanted to make sure I say it for the audience's sake because literally specialism and generalism have been in our species forever. But it's because of generalism that our humanity has survived and thrived. And one thing that like Dan Coe's a really great creator right now, he blew up over last year, and other creators, I think Mil Tilsoff is his name, and myself have been talking about the digital renaissance. And being a content creator is part of that. And really adapting to all the new technologies that have come out. All these new social platforms, they're not just for entertainment. They are what methods of influence and being able to share ideas. And when you realize like the potential of that, there's a lot that you can accomplish. And I think that taking advantage of the digital renaissance, you have to be a generalist because you have to be able to adapt to all the changes. The social platforms change month to month, if not every 6 months, every year. And understanding those changes and adapting to them and being successful with that, you need to be a generalist.
Hmm. What about those who have no interest in this digital renaissance of sorts?
It really doesn't matter what field you're in. AI is not going to take your job, but people with AI will take your job. And a lot of jobs are changing. So while I don't agree with some people saying that, like, oh, AI is going to get rid of all graphics designers, it's not. Same with video editors, it's not. People using AI to speed up the process probably will be taking your job. And I don't think every video editor is going to be using AI, not every single one, not for a while, but a majority of them will to help advance certain process. Like when I do interviews, I might use AI to cut out all the ums and uhs and all of the pauses, and maybe use AI to help with multicam streams or something like that. Using AI and other tools, not just AI, but even like let's say automation tools like Zapier or Repurpose.io, or I was telling you before the call, Opus Clip to do my short form content based off my interviews. These are things that are coming out that if you ignore them, even if you don't want to be a journalist, even if you don't want to be using new technology in the digital renaissance, you're just shooting yourself in the foot,
Hmm. I would
even if
agree
you're a
with
specialist. Yeah.
I
So,
would agree with you there. Certainly, a couple points I might want to push back on, especially surrounding AI.
yeah.
I personally think that if your job is done on a computer, there is a within the next 10 years or so, there is a
Mhm.
99% chance that your job will be null and void. Like, just my opinion, but there's certainly some things that I don't think will be null and void, like
Yeah.
podcasting or things that absolutely require a human to be there. But if
The
you're just
creativity
like if you're a
aspect.
bean counter, or if you're like
Yeah.
if your entire existence is meant to just function on a computer where AI is literally born and raised, it's like
Mhm.
I don't know. Like, maybe your job will be around, maybe it won't. I personally lean towards the camp of it probably won't, but we'll just have to wait and see. Only time will tell.
I think that kind of brings out the fact that generalism is a smart play because then you can adapt if it does happen. It may not, but you don't want to take that chance.
Hmm. As Warren Buffett says, I'm pretty sure it was Warren Buffett. Diversity is a hedge against risk.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And one thing I talk about on my second channel, which is Poly Tools, where I talk about different tools and content creators and becoming a modern content creator, is don't put all your eggs in one basket. Back in like 2018, 2019, YouTube had its quote unquote adpocalypse where all these advertisers were pulling out and a ton of creators lost their income. TikTok has been almost banned 3 times. It might end up being banned this year. This is 2024 when we're recording this. It probably won't. I think it will probably survive. But the thing is, because it happened 2 or 3 times before, the thing is, you don't know. And if TikTok is your only platform, you're screwed. And there's a lot of creators who put all their eggs in one basket, and now they're seeing repercussions. I was on Vine back in the day, and it disappeared overnight.
I find it so interesting that Vine was like huge for maybe what, two,
Three,
three, four
yeah, something
years
like that.
at most. Then suddenly it was dead. A couple
Yeah,
years go by. What's it been? Like maybe a decade.
it's like
Maybe
2013, something like that.
2013. Yeah, it's been about a decade since then. And suddenly short form video is back on. Like
Yeah.
ebbs and
Well, and
flows of
TikTok,
ebbs and flows of culture.
yeah, didn't mean to interrupt there. The delay is brutal. It's interesting to think about like when someone brought this up to me the other night. I forgot. TikTok was 15 seconds when it first came out.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. But anyways, back to the whole generalist stuff. So, in your opinion, you've talked to a lot of people about polymathy, generalism, and such. What are some of the most common misconceptions that you hear that you are confronted with about it?
Uh, well, this is perfect for this show. The jack of all trades, master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one.
The
Most
quote that
people
is always misattributed and misquoted.
yes. Well, if you look at the first half, it's a negative connotation. When you look at the second half, it's a positive connotation. And the thing is, you mentioned how you think that all these terms are synonyms, and I think that a lot of people have that same mindset. So when people hear the word polymath, they think of jack of all trades. And that can cause a negative connotation to polymathy, which is why I also kind of make that I personally make the distinction between the two, because I personally think there is a distinction. Whether there is or isn't is a different point altogether. But by making that connotation, if someone who has no idea what either one of these terms really mean, they only know that one quote, then they think jack of all trades is spreading themselves too thin. It's a negative connotation. And then if polymathy is the same thing, then polymathy is spreading yourself too thin. It's a negative connotation. And I don't like that people misrepresent that. Either one, mind you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. Have there been any other big, interesting, or weird misconceptions you've heard about like this realm?
I think, yeah, the other thing is ego, because again, I kind of mentioned this earlier with the whole polymathy thing. There's some people who choose the word polymath at an ego. They're like, oh, I want to be many different things. But most people who identify with any term, let alone polymath, they do it because they finally found a word that describes themselves. And they're like, oh, this is me. Now I can finally tell people, I can market myself to people essentially. What am I about? I'm not just a painter, I'm also the sculptor and the engineer, and then like, a scientist. And one of my prime examples of a guest on my show is Dr. Merritt Moore. I love her. She's fascinating. I love her as like a subject matter even too, just because she is a professional ballerina, so artistic. And then she also does quantum and laser physics. And so the scientist. And then she's teaching herself robotics to dance with a robot. And it's like she's combining both areas as I guess a prime example of someone who's polymathic by taking the arts and science and seeing the bridge between the two.
Mm-hmm. Innovation happens to the cross section of at least two unlikely ideas. And if
Mm-hmm.
ballerina and robotics isn't two unlikely ideas, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
I look forward to seeing whatever the hell happens there, because that's going to be interesting no
Probably gonna
matter
become an
what.
astronaut.
Yep, I look forward to it. But absolutely, I agree with you on some of that. That there is some level of ego, some level of like I don't know how else to put it, but I know I get some of that of like, oh, I feel great knowing that I can do this, I can do that. Like seeing that list, that undeniable stack of proof behind me that says I did that
Yeah.
thing. That's super cool. I don't know if I would call it ego or like a confidence boost, but maybe a bit
I
of
think
both.
I don't think that us as people who are multidisciplinary choosing those words are thinking ego. I think it's like what other people think, especially the specialists, because they think that, oh, because you're a multi-specialist, you're better than me. And it's like,
Okay.
no, that's not what we're saying. I get why they think that, but that's not what we're saying.
Although sometimes it is true.
Sometimes it is true, yeah.
As the saying
Especially if
goes,
you're like multi-expert,
Yeah, as the saying goes, jack of all trades is master of none, but often better than the master of one. Often, not always.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, looking at this whole diverse landscape, you've developed a number of skills over the years. Would you say so?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
If you had to choose just 5 core skills to be the only skills that you would have, essentially cutting down everything that you've learned, everything that you've done, say, if I were to go back and I had to start over and only choose 5 to be the most, what you would consider to be your most valuable skills that you would keep, what would be your 5 skills of choice and why?
First and foremost, because of the digital renaissance, I would say content creation, and repurposing kind of goes into that because that is one of my expertise. I coach people on it, I make content around it. I'm also making content myself, and that's an area that I'm very passionate about. I get nerdy about it even. I've taught swimming for over a decade. I have 2 swim lessons later today, even, and I'm going to write a book on that. And if I'm only known for one thing, then that's probably one of the first things I'll ever be known for. People know me as the Aquaman kind of guy.
So, content creation and swimming? Question mark?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, swimming. And swim instruction, I guess, is part of that. But
Mm-hmm.
they and even just aquatic fitness.
All
The
right.
next thing,
3.
well, that's two. It's just aquatic fitness
Yeah,
and then
I'm
content.
sorry. I'm saying on to number 3.
Sorry, I'm
Yep.
rambling.
You're all good.
The other thing, building a computer is not something that I'm like, oh, I know every single thing about, but I know definitely way more than the average person, probably a journeyman level. And I've been doing it since I was 10 years old, thanks to my uncle. And I think that by having that skill, understanding how a computer works, it allows you to understand how most technology works. So even your tiny little smartwatch or a tiny little pacemaker kind of thing, they all work essentially the same way with the short-term memory, long-term memory, etc.
So, content creation, swim instruction, tech repair, that's what I'll call it.
Little computer, yeah, tech repair, I
Mm-hmm.
guess.
On to
Okay.
4.
Those are the main 3 areas that I know that I am an expert in. When it comes to lesser areas, I think like Lego building, for example, is something I've always been passionate about because it teaches you to be able to play and have the ability to adapt to different situations and rebuild and think of things in a systematic way.
Lego building.
Additionally, yes, I
Hmm.
think that's something that I think is really interesting. It's not something that's like, oh, it's a really big skill, but I think that you need to, even as an adult, you need to play and you need to have your hands doing something. And as much as I love being a creative on the computer in the digital realm, it's not physical. And I don't know woodworking. I don't know how to build a house. I'm a pretty handy person when it comes to like doing repairs or doing stuff in the house, especially as I've gotten older, I've noticed. But it's not a skill that I'm passionate about. Legos, I think, helps define like that motor control and stuff like that. Another thing that I think I am quite an expert in, it's not necessarily going to help the world, but it helps me individually. And I should say note taking, but I think gaming is the one I'm going to say is the 5th one because gaming, again, coming back down to play, it's taught me 3D spatial awareness. Like I have a 3D map in my head of the area in Houston that I went to 2 years ago because I was able to have that visual memory. And I think that I have that visual memory, that strong visual capacity because of video games, being able to remember the maps and areas that I'm venturing in for. And like you said earlier, role playing games definitely have that story aspect to help teach me different tropes and different things that happen in history. Because even if you're just playing a role playing game, it's often based off of historical events too, in some shape or form. Like Game of Thrones is based off a lot of UK and British history, essentially. And so it's just one of those things where, like, yeah, a lot of role playing games have that same aspect. And I've
Mm-hmm.
played a lot of different styles. I don't pick just one genre.
All right. I want to dig into the Lego and gaming a bit more because those
Yeah.
were 2 that I was not expecting. And they're 2 that I think are the points that you had behind them, I think are very important that people could get a lot from. So
Mhm.
you mentioned Lego that it's important for people to play. Like it's important for even adults to play. Why do you think that is?
So it comes back down to neurostimuli, and I definitely think that that Lego area of expertise falls right into that knowledge management that we talked about at the beginning. Because I basically approach my knowledge management system like I exactly how I do with Lego stuff. And growing up, I would do my own little role playing games with the Lego pieces. I would actually act out the different stories. It definitely was like Zelda, for example. I would do like little Zelda games with Legos, and I was constantly trying to come up with these different worlds and express my creativity. And it was one of the few outlets that I have, especially for decompression, but also creativity. And again, the hand eye coordination too, being able to put together different things. I found myself, especially building those little Lego ships, trying to be able to make movable parts, like get the walls to move, get the back to open up like an actual spaceship, and trying to solve those problems definitely helped my systematic thinking and how systems work.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot to that. Uh, Lately,
A lot to unpack.
I've heard more about Legos in these past few like weeks and months than I've ever expected I would be hearing about. I've heard about on so many different podcasts of adults getting back into Legos or new adult Lego sets. Like, huh,
Mhm.
that's cool. Like you, I grew up with tons and tons of Legos, so many Legos. I remember as one of my brother and I's big Christmas gifts was this big
Sorry.
25-pound bag of Legos that
Mhm.
my parents had gotten off of eBay or something. And I think we might still have that bag of Legos to this day that we
You
got.
better, because those things keep value so well.
Hmm. And maybe we just gave them away to some other neighborhood kids. But anyways, there's something about just sitting down and working with your hands and building and just doing this, making something with your bare hands, something about that that's so
Mm,
relaxing. And that I know personally for me, it's not Legos, it's woodworking or it's metalworking or it's making something
right.
similar, but it's a similar principle where I know that when I'm working on something, my mind can wander freely, and that's when I get most of my great ideas. It's not when I'm actively sitting down at my computer saying, I need to come up with some new ideas for this upcoming
Yeah.
episode. I'm going to think about it for a while. Like, does that work every once in a while? Maybe. But like the best ideas, the ones that really hit home, are always the ones that
Mhm.
happen when I'm sitting on the floor in pajamas with like a wood carving knife and just carving a like something for 2 or 3 hours that suddenly it's like, oh wow, inspiration out the wazoo. I have to write this all down.
There's something to come on my show a few times where this idea between simple problems and complex problems, like even like wicked problems, if you want to throw that into the complex area. And when you're doing simple problems, those are the things that are going to get automated by AI. And like you said, the bean counting, for example. But by doing simple problems, your brain kind of shuts off a little bit. You kind of just get used to it. It's not until you have to get to the wicked problems or the complex problems where you actually have to start thinking creatively to help solve them. But I think that wood carving and Lego building, they're all simple problems for the most part. Sometimes they can get complex when you get to some more advanced things, but that's kind of getting into the weeds of stuff. But I think that by doing the simple work and just doing the reps, essentially, you're able to kind of think a little bit more outside the box. I find myself when I'm making simple content coming up with more ideas because I'm like, oh, that's another pathway I could have taken that down too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's just human beings, we need boredom. We need simple things that so we can just shut our brains off for a bit and go work. I feel like that's sort of the problem with a lot of this high dopamine, high action content that we get so
Hmm.
much of the time that we almost outsource our thinking to other places. Could dig deeper into that, but I'll just leave that there for now. So, when you're working on learning a new skill, I know you've mentioned this personally one on one with me briefly that you were working on some game development stuff. But when you're approaching a new skill, how do you like? What's your general approach when you say, "I want to go and learn this thing"? Where do you like to start?
I take a polymathic approach. I like taking a swath of information in, whether it's so I'm not particular when it comes to written versus video. I think a lot of people have a certain learning style, and I definitely think the polymathic aspect to me shines through on this point where I do anything. Like it's podcasts, videos, blog posts, courses, books, audiobooks. I take in all of it, and I think that helps me get a holistic understanding of something. And then when I need more details and like I'm doing the Feynman technique to break it down more and more, I realize like what do I need to learn? Then I'm able to kind of refine that search. So Googling is a skill and being able to find things on there is a skill. And one example of that that people just don't realize right off the bat is that don't use just the basic Google feed. You use images too. Images are some of the best to find stuff. But even like the Google News category, like to search that way, I sometimes find little diamonds in the Google News search. Not always, but sometimes those one like that one thing on that Google News feed is not on the images or the actual normal Google search. And so by taking an approach of doing all of them, so videos, images, regular search, and a news search, it allows me to get a understanding of what all is out there. Like I mentioned earlier with polymath and generalist and jotes, I looked those keywords up. I went through all four of those different tabs and I actually did this on Google, Bing, and Yahoo, maybe DuckDuckGo even, just so I could see if one of the search engines didn't have it, maybe the other ones did. And I think there was a few examples of that. I don't think you always need to do that, especially nowadays, because Google generally has 95% of everything you're going to find. But there was a few different articles and stuff like that that I did not find on those different pathways. But when it comes to like learning a new skill, I might look on different unorthodox places. There's a lot of people who use TikTok for search now instead of Google. Twitter is surprisingly sometimes good. Like when I searched polymath on there, I found a decent amount of people who are generalists and jack of all trades as well. I found a unique amount of people on that. And the same thing goes for Reddit too. So just not looking at just one source.
Hmm. So
That's how
starting
I
off
start.
starting off with research, what sort of things are you searching? Are you searching for how to do X, or is it like just sort of general key phrases of like maybe you'll just look up the skill itself, or I don't know what sort of things are you looking up?
I can't necessarily define what the phrase or keywords would be. Sometimes it's literally just a keyword like generalist. Sometimes it is a phrase. Like technically jack of all trades is a phrase, but I kind of consider that more of a keyword. But sometimes that might be like an actual phrase or sentence. And then like how to do podcasting, for example. Like when I learned content creation, that's essentially what I did. Like how do you become a podcaster? Recently, I think I've been looking up like vertical live streaming or how to do multi-streaming, for example, because I want to do that for my gaming channel. And I think it's one of those things where you're not going to find the answers right away, but by either looking up articles and saving them for later or reading them now, you can start to kind of compound resources, hoard them like a dragon, if you will. And eventually, those resources, like saving to later. I love on Medium and YouTube saving stuff to later. If I'm not ready to look at it now and absorb the information now, I'll save it for later. And then when I'm ready to actually listen and pay attention and like deep focus, then I'll watch it.
How do you know when enough's enough? Because all too often we get people who say, I'm gonna do this thing after I read one more book or after I watch one more video, and that's just one more, just another, just maybe one or two more. And they never actually do the thing.
It's a good question. I'm not sure if I have the full answer to it, but I definitely can tell you the extremes of it. So I read this somewhere that like once you read 200 business books, you basically read everything on the market for that genre, and that kind of goes for any genre really. Once you've consumed like 200 pieces, maybe it comes back to the whole 100 reps thing too. Like once you put in 100 reps, 100 articles, like you basically know everything you're going to need to know about it. I think a good prime example is being a podcast host. When I became a host, I essentially knew all the skills that I needed to know for it. And I that is kind of ego sounding, but I just did so much research. I probably did too much research when it came to like podcasting in general as a host, but interviewing and different interviewing skills. And it wasn't until I did 6 interviews where I realized I need to fix my intro. The flow of the show needs to be tweaked a little bit. Same thing happened like 25 interviews in. And basically since then, I've never had to really tweak it. For the second show, I definitely did. But again, that's a whole new set of 100 reps because it's a new show. But I still knew how to be a host and how to be a good host. But my point is, it wasn't until I actually did the skill that I actually knew what I needed to learn from next. And so there's only so much learning you can do by just researching and taking in information. Sometimes you have to actually do the skill.
Hmm. So for the people who are maybe stuck in that information, like information hoarding, for lack of a better term, how
Yeah.
can we help them just get out of that? Say, stop information hoarding, go try the thing. Then if you really need to learn something else, come back and learn how to fix that thing. How can we help them to break out of their cage?
I have a love hate relationship with the Pareto principle, 80% rule, as some people might refer to it as 80/20.
Hmm.
And I think that this rule, though, really applies to what you're asking there. If you've taken in like 80% of the information, you don't need to find that last 20%. Like you don't need to become a hyper expert in this field. Like you just need to get going and start doing it kind of thing. And I think it also kind of goes back down to specialization too. Like you don't need to be hyper specialist in most areas. As long as you are above the journeyman, you're going to be above 90% of the people in the world anyways, or 80% of the people in the world.
Hmm.
So there's just a certain point, and every skill is different, especially if it's simple versus complex skills. If it's a complex skill, you might want to take in more information, but even then, you really need to start practicing because you're not going to get the skill. Like chess, even though chess is a hard skill to learn and get really masterful at, it is a simple skill. Like it's all pattern recognition, all systematic thinking. Once you know the patterns, you know the skill well. But things like that are creative, like Lego building, that can be any which way you want. Those are complex. Like those are going to have almost infinite options.
Yeah, agreed. It, I feel like I bring this up with a lot of people. I try to like draw out these nuggets of how do we
Mhm.
get people to actually start, and almost every time it's just you just got to do it because no matter how many books you read, no matter what you do, the only person who actually makes progress on the thing is the guy who stops researching and actually goes and does it. I can't
Yeah.
tell you how many people I've heard say, I'm going to go write that book. and a year later they're still saying, I'm gonna go write that book, and they haven't put a single
That's
word
me.
on the page.
I'm still trying to write my book.
Yeah, but you're making progress on other stuff. Like, it amazes me still, though, how many people will say, I'm gonna go do that thing, and then years and years and years go by, and maybe they just never stopped wanting to do that thing, but they never actually took the
Mm,
action to go and do it. Like, other things may catch their interest, but they never go and do those things either. And it's just like they get stuck in the monotony of life, I guess the best way I can put it. And the only answer seems to be just got to shake yourself out of that research cycle and just go and do it.
yeah. And I mean, research is fun, especially for people who like us. And I don't think you need to stop per se, but you definitely need to switch it. Like when you first start out, 80% research, 20% doing. And then once you get past that first, like decent research phase, you need to switch it to 80% doing, 20% research.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. So I've got a question for you that's a bit tying a bit of the knowledge management and jack of all trades stuff together, and a bit of your gaming stuff that you've been working on as well. There's a saying in the game development world that players will optimize the fun out of a game if you let them. And I think the same goes for almost everything. Perhaps not just for knowledge management, but for learning skills in general. So, how can we try to keep things simple yet effective, where perhaps they can't optimize the fun out of it? It's the best way I can put it.
It kind of goes back to that Notion thing where since Notion was so Lego-like, I think a lot of people who are Notion gurus always said this too, where it's like you constantly are rebuilding your dashboard and rebuilding your system to try to make it more and more efficient. When in actuality, you just need to use the system, and that's where a lot of people learn. Like, okay, I need to just actually use it, not keep messing with it. Because I was doing a lot of content creation when I was in Notion because I had a working system. If I missed a day, it was very easy to push everything back and just move it to the next day. And that was my issue with other tools where I wasn't able to do that effectively. Even right now, I'm not able to do that in Obsidian and I have to do a different methodology, but it's at least working for me right now. I'm using like a Kanban board instead of using Kanban as in like starting, doing, finished kind of thing. I'm just doing each column is a different content type and I prioritize which the next one I'm going to do. And I basically do that when I'm ready to do it. But I think you just need to know what you want to accomplish, how long is it going to take, and try not to overcomplicate your system when it comes to that. You need to be able to fall back on your system, and if your system's too complex, you can't fall back on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. For the person who's interested in starting down the generalist path, someone who maybe isn't so sure about this whole polymathy thing, they approach you and say, Hey, Dustin, I want to try this whole polymath thing out, and I see you've been doing it for a while, but I don't know where to start. What should I do?
It's not about being a polymath; it's about being polymathic. I think jack of all trades, generalists, multipotentialites, they're all polymathic. And again, I mentioned the whole scale, but even disregarding the scale, even if you just want to be a jack of all trades and call it a day, it's a matter of approaching things in a mindset of being multidisciplinary and doing different things. Don't hinder yourself just because you are surrounded by specialists and they're pushing you to be down one narrow path. If you want to be known for many different things, market yourself for those different things. If you're known for three different skills like plumbing, electricity, electrical, and wood carving, then you make four or three different funnels for each one. And that way, if someone wants to know what you're doing, you could say, I'm a plumber, I'm an electrician. Yes, you are all of them, but until they know you as just one thing, then you could expand beyond that once they know you for that one thing. Once they know you as a plumber, then you could be like, I am also an electrician. I am also a wood carver and house builder, that kind of thing. When I taught my swimming, for example, I also taught water aerobics. I also taught personal training, but everyone saw me as a swimmer first and foremost. And eventually I had to tell them, like, no, I also do this. I also do this.
Right. Gotta be intentional about it. Rare,
It's marketing.
very rarely are people going to just fall into it. Sure, we'll have every once in a while people be Da Vinci or they'll be Dustin or they'll be me and they'll say, yeah, I actually just want to do everything. And like that'll happen. But I agree for sure. For someone who is just taking their first steps into this, even just that desire, like that's all you need to start. Just the desire to go and
Mhm.
try more, to go and do more, and then to actually go and try it.
Right. And it is basically the biggest thing I could say is that for all these different terms, but especially the polymath, is that curiosity. Like I think that the level of curiosity you have also kind of levels up when you go to those different terms. And when you're a polymath level, you are just insatiably curious. Like nothing you can do to cure that curiosity. And that's a good thing. I think, especially because we're in a special society, that curiosity gets tampered down and like people get confined too much and they are encouraged not to be curious or discouraged to be curious. I mean,
Mm-hmm. Yep. There's a surprising amount of that where supposedly the education system is there to foster creativity and to foster curiosity when I distinctly remember a lot of questions that people would ask be, well,
mhm,
it's just because we do it because we've always done it that way, or we do it because that's how you're supposed to do it. And questions are like, I can understand to some extent of you don't want to derail the whole class for this one question, but at the
yeah.
same time, there's good ways to do it and there's not so good ways to do it. And yeah, we need to keep this curiosity, this creativity alive. Dustin, what else are you working on? What do you have going on in the future?
Right now, I'm focusing on my 3 YouTube channels, which are essentially 3 of my main brands. I have Poly Innovator, which is my main personal brand. That channel is about knowledge management for polymath. So if you want to organize your multidisciplinary life, that is the best place for that. I'm the only person talking about this in that space where most people are talking about it from a specialist point of view. I'm trying to take it from a generalist point of view. The second channel is called Poly Tools, and I'm creating a website of polymathic creator tools that you can use. So all the different knowledge management tools I've come across are on there. All the different content repurposing tools are on there, and that way you can kind of see like holistically what's available on the market. And then the second channel is a gaming channel. I'm focusing on Pokemon going forward. I always grew up with that series, and I think that it's going to help me because you mentioned the video game development. The game I want to develop is a game kind of like Pokemon, and I figured if I could build up an audience around that, then I can eventually make the game, and people will follow over to it. And then I have my swimming stuff too, where I'm trying to make my book.
I gotta ask, what's your favorite Pokemon generation?
I grew up with third generation, so that's probably it.
All right, fair, respectable.
Yeah, I mean fourth is pretty good too, though.
Mm-hmm. Good music, very slow.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Where else can people go to see more of your stuff? Or does that basically summarize it?
Polyinnovator.space is my website, and pretty much everything is linked off of there. And yeah, really, if you can find Poly Innovator pretty much on every platform.
Well, Dustin, I appreciate you coming on today. It's been an absolute pleasure and look forward
You as
to
well.
chatting with you again.
Thanks for having me on, and we'll chat on either one of our shows again at some point.
Yep, ciao.
Ciao.
If you enjoyed this episode, then please share with a friend you think would like it or share it on social media. It would absolutely mean the world to me and helps the podcast grow so much. With all that said, thanks for listening. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll talk to y'all later.